August 1st, 1943, 12,000 feet over Ploesti, Romania. The sky is a shifting furnace of black smoke, detonating flak shells, and rising heat from the burning oil fields below. The Liberator, known as Whistlin Devil, holds steady in the chaos, its aluminum skin already rattling from near hits. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Bobby Mercer wipes a sheet of sweat from his eyes as he fights the vibration running. Through every bolt of the B-24, the air reeks of burnt cordite, engine oil, and fear. You can hear the oxygen masks hissing, the intercom crackling, and far below, the rumble of German defenses waking the entire valley to Mercer's right. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Halbrook James, stares out the canopy as another black cloud erupts just yards in front of them. Shrapnel whizzing past the glass like angry hornets. They're walking it right onto us, he mutters through clenched teeth. Mercer already knows. The altimeter wavers as the Liberator dips from the blast wave. Behind them, in the top turret, Staff Sergeant Raymond Ortiz rotates the heavy .50 caliber, guns toward a flash of light near a rooftop flak position. He isn't aiming to hit anything. He's just firing back so the crew feels like they're still in the fight below the bomber. Ploesti looks like the entrance to the underworld. Oil tanks are erupting one after another, flames climbing hundreds of feet into the air, casting the bomber's shadow across the smoke like a ghost flickering over a battlefield. The mission planners had warned them that Ploesti was one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, but the intelligence briefings didn't come close to this. Guns are everywhere, on rooftops, on train cars, hidden between oil drums, camouflaged inside barns. Every street corner, every yard, every refinery tower is spitting lead or fire into the sky in the bomb bay. Technical Sergeant Paul Keller lies flat on the catwalk, counting down the seconds until the drop. He can feel the aircraft shaking beneath him, the metal flexing like a living thing. He grips the release handle, knuckles white through his gloves, whispering a rhythm to himself, steady, steady, steady. Above him, he hears the drone of a dying engine from somewhere outside, maybe theirs, maybe another ship in the formation. The intercom erupts with a voice from the tail. 7 o'clock. Mi-109's diving, but the bomb run locks them in. They can't maneuver, can't dodge, can't break away. In these moments, the B-24 is nothing more than a flying target praying to stay airborne. Mercer forces himself to ignore the fighters. He focuses on the bombardier's countdown. 10 seconds. 9, 8. Another flak burst hits, so close that the cockpit lights flicker and the right wing jolts downward. The whole plane lurches as shrapnel tears into the fuselage behind the cockpit, slicing through wiring and punching through the aluminum skin like it's wet paper. Halbrook checks the gauge's fuel pressure dropping on engine 3. Oxygen feed fluctuating. Hydraulic warning lights blinking. Another explosion rocks them. This one feels different, the metallic slam beneath their feet. Keller shouts, "Bomb bay hit. We're taking fragments." Ortiz keeps firing from the top turret, yelling over the intercom, "They're zeroing us. They're zeroing us." And still, the countdown continues. 3 seconds. 2, 1. The Liberator suddenly rises as 2,000 pounds of bombs release cleanly. Keller grabs the rail as the plane jerks upward from the weight loss. Down below, the refinery erupts in a rolling fireball, the shockwave punching upward through the clouds of smoke as if trying to grab the Liberator by the tail and rip it from the sky. Mercer banks hard left, trying to claw altitude before the next cluster of guns swings toward them. Halbrook calls out, "Engine 3's smoking pressure's gone." Then it happens, single, thunderous blasts so close it blinds the cockpit in white light. When the smoke clears, Mercer sees daylight through new holes in the left wing. Hundreds of jagged punctures. The skin looks like it's been chewed by a steel tornado. The Liberator shudders, gasping like a wounded animal still trying to stay aloft. But it isn't falling. Not yet, and in the chaos. Mercer can't help whispering something no one hears over the roar of the remaining engines. If this ship wants to live, then we're going to live with it. The blast still echoes through the frame when Mercer yanks the control column to stabilize the wounded bomber. The artificial horizon trembles. The Liberator feels heavier now, slower to respond, as if the air itself has turned to syrup. Smoke from Engine 3 trails behind them in a dirty grey ribbon that curls and twists through the flak bursts still rising below. Halbrook checks the engine readings again, tapping the gauge as if sheer willpower might bring the pressure back. "She's done," he says, voice low. "We're flying on 3. Mercer doesn't answer. He can't. His jaw is locked, muscles stone hard. Every instinct screams to gain altitude, but climbing on 3 engines with torn wings is suicide. Staying low means hitting more guns. Every choice feels fatal. Behind them, Ortiz keeps scanning the smoky horizon for fighters. The Me-109s and 110s that slashed into the formation moments earlier have disappeared behind the oil plumes. But they'll be back. They always come back. Down in the radio compartment, Sergeant Tommy Vance tries to reach the rest of the scattered formation. Static, snaps, ghost voices swallowed by interference. The flak towers are jamming everything. He keeps trying, switching channels, adjusting frequency dials with shaking hands. Suddenly, a burst of shrapnel tears through the fuselage near his shoulder, showering him with insulation. He hits the floor instinctively, heart racing, but he's alive. "Still transmitting," he whispers, forcing himself back into his seat in the waist section. Gunners Benton and Cruz brace themselves against the cold wind ripping through new holes in the skin. The temperature drops fast at this altitude, and neither man can stop shivering. Benton slaps another belt of .50 caliber rounds into the feed tray, the metal clattering over the floor. He looks through the open side window. Flames leap from the ground like the earth is trying to burn the sky itself. "I can't even see the rest of our group," he says. Cruz doesn't look away from his gun. They'll be out there. They have to be. Suddenly, the bomber lurches again as a cluster of flak bursts opens beneath them, lifting the entire aircraft in a violent shove. It feels like invisible fists are hammering the belly. Keller in the bomb bay yells over the intercom, "I've got daylight down here." We're torn open. The catwalk beneath him rattles with every new blast. He presses himself flat against the narrow beam, praying the next hit doesn't peel the floor away. Mercer scans ahead. They're almost clear of Ploesti's main flak zone. Almost. He grips the column, nudging the plane into a shallow right turn. Halbrook leans forward, eyes flicking between gauges. "We lose another engine and we're done," he mutters. Mercer finally speaks, his voice steady but hollow. "We won't." But the sky isn't finished with them. Not even close. A sudden burst of tracer fire streaks past the cockpit from below her. Hidden 20mm battery behind a warehouse roof they skimmed too close to. The shells arc upward like burning orange beads. One detonates near the right waist window with a deafening crack. Cruz staggers back from his gun mount, coughing through smoke and insulation. "I'm hit. I'm hit," he shouts. Benton grabs him, checking frantically. Shrapnel tore through the gunner's shoulder, blood soaking through his flight jacket. Cruz stays conscious, gripping Benton's sleeve. "Don't let them get on our tail." Mercer hears the call and feels the familiar flash of dread. A wounded man, a dying engine, holes in every wing surface. And the fighters haven't even returned yet, as the last of Ploesti's flak towers finally drop behind them. The bomber emerges into thinner, clearer air, but clarity brings no comfort. They're alone. The formation is gone, scattered across miles of burning sky. The smoke blanket below stretches out like an ocean of black waves swallowing the city. Vance finally breaks through the static. With a faint signal, Whistlin Devil to any friendly aircraft. "We are damaged and isolated. Do you copy?" Only silence answers. Inside the cockpit, Mercer takes a long breath. Ahead lies hundreds of miles of enemy territory. 3 engines carrying a bomber that looks more like a colander than a machine of war. But the crew is still alive. The ship still flies. And now comes the part no briefing ever prepared them for: the long crawl home through a sky full of enemies. Mercer tightens his harness, eyes locked on the horizon. "We go west," he says quietly, "and we don't stop for anything." The Liberator pushes westward, its engines groaning under the strain. The smoke trail behind engine 3 thins for a moment, then thickens again, curling into a dark smear that stretches across the sky. Mercer keeps the bomber lower than doctrine ever allowed skimming, just beneath the scattered cloud layer to avoid radar and hopeful flak batteries waiting below. The sun glints off the torn aluminum skin, making the aircraft sparkle like a dying comet streaking across Romanian airspace in the top turret. Ortiz squints through the gun sight. The vibration makes everything shimmer, and the sweat under his mask stings his eyes. He rotates the turret a few degrees at a time, scanning the horizon. He's done this so many times in training that it should feel routine. But nothing about this feels ordinary now. This is the part of the mission where fighters come hunting, where every damaged bomber becomes prey. Then he sees them. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Ortiz's shout slams through the intercom like a hammer. Mercer snaps his eyes upward, catching the faint glint of sunlight on wings small, angular, closing fast. Mi-109s, at least 4, maybe 6. More slipping in behind clouds. Coming in fast. Halbrook mutters under his breath. "Here we go." Ortiz grips the handles of the 50s. Benton and Cruz brace themselves in the waist section. Cruz fighting through the pain in his shoulder as he pulls himself back to his gun. The fighters dive, silhouettes sharpening as they descend. Their engines scream like tearing metal. Mercer yanks the Liberator left, trying to angle the tail guns into a better position. The bomber shudders, violently eats torn wings, protesting every banking motion. He feels the controls fighting him, as if the aircraft itself is begging not to be pushed any harder. The first fighter opens fire from above, glowing tracers pouring down in a tight stream. They rake across the fuselage, punching holes through the top skin. Metal shrieks. Ortiz fires back, long bursts that vibrate through the entire turret. "Come on, come on," he whispers between clenched teeth. The Mi-109 breaks off, but another slides into place instantly, diving straight toward the cockpit. Mercer sees, it knows flashes, guns spitting fire. "Hang on," he shouts. The fighter's rounds slam into the nose. shattering plexiglass and sending shards spraying through the bombardier's compartment. The dead bombardier's station is empty now, scorched by earlier hits. But the damage worsens, the wind tearing into the cockpit. Halbrook shields his eyes as glass scatters across the floor. "This is insane," he gasps. They smell blood. Ortiz swings the turret to follow the fighter on its exit, firing again. The shells from his guns trailing arcs of brass across the sky. One round connects. A puff of smoke bursts near the fighter's cowling. It wobbles, but continues climbing. Not enough, Ortiz growls, rotating again in the waist. Benton yells, 6 o'clock. They're coming in low. Cruz manages to swing his gun, grimacing from the pain. Two fighters slash upward in a climbing attack, their tracers glowing red as they pour fire into the damaged tail. The structure shakes violently. Panels peel. The horizontal stabilizer vibrates like it might rip away entirely. Cruz squeezes the trigger, unleashing a full belt. Benton joins him, both machine guns roaring in unison. One ME-109 rolls away, sharply smoke trailing from its wing root. The other keeps coming. Mercer hears the rounds hammering the rear of the aircraft, each impact a deep metallic punch. Tail control. He calls. From the back comes a strained voice. It's holding. Barely holding. The fighters regroup, swinging wide to line up another attack. Ortiz watches their formation shift, their movements far too coordinated for comfort. This isn't random harassment. This is a finishing run. "Mercer," Halbrook says quietly, "we can't take another pass like that." Mercer knows. They all know. But there's nowhere to run. No altitude to climb. No formation to hide inside. Just a broken bomber flying alone through hostile skies. Then something unexpected happens. The fighters hesitate. They spread out. They veer slightly left. Benton notices it first. They're breaking off. Why are they? He doesn't finish. Because he sees them. Far off to the Whistlin specks, at first another formation of bombers is approaching. American, not theirs, but close enough. Close enough that the German fighters reconsider their chances. "Come on," Mercer whispers. "Come on." The fighters make one final pass, firing long. Spiteful bursts at the Liberator before banking away and disappearing into the hazy afternoon air. The attack ends as suddenly as it began. The crew exhales collectively, each man shaking, exhausted, barely holding on to consciousness. The bomber is still flying, but its right wing looks like it's been carved open by giant knives. Fuel drips from shredded lines. Ailerons flutter. Fabric flaps in the SLIPSTREAM. Halbrook looks over the damage, then back at Mercer. "We're not making it home unless this ship gives us a miracle." Mercer nods once. "Then we let her decide." He pushes the throttles forward, praying the remaining engines will hold. The Liberator limps westward. Every mile a negotiation between gravity and sheer stubborn will. Engine 3 coughs again, backfiring with a hollow bang that vibrates through the entire airframe. Mercer steadies the controls, keeping the nose level. Oil pressure is almost gone. Temperature needle spiking. The engine is dying slowly, painfully like a wounded limb, trying to keep pace with the rest of the body. Inside the cockpit, the wind howls through the shattered nose glazing, whipping loose maps and flooding the compartment with freezing air. Halbrook pulls his jacket tighter, breath fogging inside his mask. "We need to check the fuel situation," he says, reaching for the overhead valve switches. Mercer nods below the cockpit floor. Keller crawls along the narrow bomb bay catwalk, flashlight beam trembling over jagged holes torn through the belly. He shines it across the fuel lines. One of them spurts, a slow but steady drizzle, atomizing instantly in the cold air. "We're leaking out of tank 2, Keller calls. "A lot. Looks like shrapnel punched straight through the feed line." He reaches into a pouch and pulls out tape and a scrap of rubber sheeting. "It isn't standard procedure. It isn't in any manual. But out here, improvisation is survival." As he works, Keller can feel the aircraft flex with every gust of turbulence. Metal creaks. Somewhere forward, the sound of loose aluminum flick-flack-flicks against the slipstream. Every noise is a reminder that this ship has taken more punishment than any engineer ever imagined. In the radio compartment, Vance is still trying to make contact with friendly aircraft. The static is relentless. His ears ring from the earlier blast, but he refuses to stop. Suddenly, through the noise, a faint voice breaks through. "Devil, repeat. Identify." Vance grabs the microphone. "This is Whistlin Devil, B-24, heavily damaged, 20 minutes east of the Carpathians, requesting escort or vector guidance." The reply fades. Comes back, fades again. Something about heading southwest. Something about fighters returning to base. Vance strains to catch every word while fighting the tangle of torn wires dangling above him in the waist section. Benton tends to Crew's shoulder wound. The bleeding is mostly stopped, but the pain hasn't eased. Crews grips his machine gun with his good hand, refusing to sit down. "If fighters come back, I'm not hiding," he mutters. Benton covers him with a blanket taken from an emergency kit and looks out the window. "After what we just went through," he says, "if the devil wants this bird, he should have taken it back there." In the top turret, Ortiz keeps scanning. His shoulders burn from the constant tension, but he doesn't let up. The sky is deceptively calm now. To calm, the crew knows that fighters often trail crippled bombers for dozens of miles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ortiz cycles the turret left again, refusing to blink. Back in the cockpit, Halbrook checks the gauges and frowns. "Engine 3 is about to seize," he says. "If it locks up, we could lose the prop." Mercer glances over. A runaway prop could tear the entire wing off if it detaches. But shutting the engine down will cost precious power they may need if they hit more flak or turbulence. Before he can answer, a sudden vibration ripples through the left wing. Flapping metal sings in the wind. Mercer grips the column tighter. "What now?" he mutters, fighting the sudden roll to the left. Halbrook peers out the side window. Aileron's damaged. It's not responding properly. He hesitates, then adds, "We're running out of control surface." Mercer feels it in the controls of sluggishness, a weight, like steering through mud. Every adjustment takes more effort. The bomber is tiring, losing strength, pieces peeling away mile by mile. He glances at the compass and the pale blue horizon beyond. They still have hours to fly. Hours through enemy territory. Hours where any mechanical failure, any fighter, any unlucky round could finish them, yet the plane still flies. "Come on, girl," Mercer whispers, patting the worn edge of the control yoke. "You got us this far." Then Vance's voice cracks over the intercom. "Mercer, I got a fix. They said if we can make it another 100 miles southwest, there's a patrol route. We might get fighters to cover us." Halbrook lets out a thin laugh, half disbelief, half desperation. 100 miles. In this thing, Mercer looks at the shredded wings, the smoking engine. The trembling fuselage, then he nods. We're going for it. He pushes the throttles, gently, carefully praying the remaining engines hold together. The Liberator groans but keeps climbing, inching toward the patrol route, toward friendly air, and toward a chance, just a chance of seeing home again. The Liberator inches southwest, every minute a small victory. The crew knows they are no longer flying a machine built for war. They are riding inside a battered skeleton, a metal ghost stitched together by luck and stubbornness. The airframe groans as if protesting each passing mile. Yet it keeps going, wings trembling but still holding their shape against the cold wind dragging across them. Mercer leans forward over the control column, eyes fixed on the horizon. The altimeter needle dips just slightly, then stabilizes. He nudges the throttles again, careful not to overstress the remaining engines. Oil streaks trail behind engine 2 now, thin but growing. She's not happy, Halbrook mutters, checking the gauges. Then we don't ask her to be, Mercer replies softly. Behind them, Keller crawls out of the bomb bay and slides into the navigator's compartment, his face streaked with grease and dust. Fuel line patched as best I could, he says. It'll hold for a while, maybe. The word hangs in the air like a question no one wants to answer. Ortiz rotates the top turret again, scanning the empty sky. Clear to clear. He's seen this pattern before. Fighters disappear, wait for a bomber to lose altitude, then come screaming back in like vultures returning to a carcass. Keep your heads on a swivel, he warns over the intercom. They'll try one more time if they think we're weak. Benton, in the waist, glances out the window and notices something unsettling. Hey, does the tail look? A sudden shudder interrupts him. The entire bomber jerks sideways, dropping several feet in a violent lurch. Mercer fights the controls instantly. What the hell was that? The answer comes as another jolt, harsher this time. The plane rolls right, then left, like a giant hand is shaking it. Ortiz braces inside the turret as the world tilts around him. In the tail section, the gunner's voice crackles through, strained and breathless. We lost part of the left stabilizer. It's flapping like a sheet in a storm. Mercer grits his teeth, adjusting trim, countering each wobble. The Liberator wants to spiral. He can feel it growing in the controls. A slow but steady pull toward instability. Halbrook adjusts the rudder trim wheels, spinning them rapidly. Come on, come on. Hold together. The bomber steadies barely. Still wobbling, but no longer diving. The sound of torn metal whipping in the wind becomes a constant background scream. Pilot, this is the tail, the gunner calls. If that stabilizer tears completely, we're done. Mercer keeps his hands locked on the yoke. Then it doesn't tear. A moment passes, then another. The sky stays empty. The engines keep turning. The bomber holds. But nature has one more test prepared. Dark clouds gather a head thin at first, then swelling into a rolling grey curtain stretching across the horizon. Halbrook rubs his forehead. Weather front. We can't climb over it. Mercer's jaw tightens. The Liberator can't handle turbulence now. The wings are perforated, ribs exposed. A bad gust could rip the structure apart. But there's no other route. Enemy territory below. Mountains ahead. And now, a storm wall rising directly in their path. Vance Mercer calls. Any word on those friendly fighters? Vance flips through frequencies, voice tense. Still nothing. Last transmission said patrol route was ahead. but they didn't say when or where they'd be. Ortiz looks westward. If fighters don't find us soon, we go into that storm blind. The nose of the bomber dips slightly as they enter the first layer of grey. The sunlight dims. Moisture streaks across shattered glass. The wind changes pitch, rising into a low-throated moan that fills the inside of the aircraft. Benton grips the overhead handles as the bomber begins to shake. Hold on to something, he warns Cruz, who braces his wounded shoulder against a bulkhead. The turbulence hits like a fist. The bomber lurches hard. Loose equipment clatters across the floor. The top turret shakes so violently, Ortiz has to lock it in place to keep from injuring his wrists. Keller slams into a wall and catches himself on a cable. Vance grips the radio set as it rattles dangerously. Mercer wrestles the yoke as the bomber drops 10 feet, then 20, then rises sharply. The wings flex, groaning under the strain. A long crack splits along the right wing skin, metal bending outward like a peeled lid. Easy. Halbrook shouts. Easy, she's coming apart. The storm wind slams them again, a twisting force that tries to spin the bomber sideways. Mercer corrects, sweat running down his temple despite the freezing air. He feels the ship turning into a wild animal beneath his hands, thrashing, resisting, desperate to break free. "Come on, girl," he whispers, voice trembling but defiant. "You've survived worse." For a terrifying moment, the bomber rolls 30 degrees, almost tipping into a death spiral. Mercer banks hard the opposite way, muscles burning. And finally, mercifully, the shaking slows, the clouds thin, and sunlight breaks through. The Liberator bursts out of the storm into a clean stretch of sky, gliding wounded but alive. The crew exhales in disbelief. The stabilizer holds. The patched fuel line holds. The engines keep turning. Mercer stares ahead. There, far in the distancer, shapes approaching. Not fighters. Bigger wings. Twin tails. B-24S.American.N if bombers are here. Fighters can't be far behind. The B-24 dropped slowly beneath the cloud deck, its ragged frame shuddering as if every bolt inside the aircraft were debating whether to hold on or finally let go. The altimeter wound down past 10,000 feet. The temperature rose. Oxygen masks came off. The men coughed from the thick smoke that still clung to their clothes, their skin, even the metal around them. Every breath tasted like burnt oil and scorched paint. Sergeant Keller leaned over his waist gun position, staring at the ground far below, marveling that they were still in the air at all. He had spent the last hour pressing towels and spare flight jackets against the jagged tiers along the fuselage, trying to stop warm air from rushing out and loose debris from whipping around the compartment. None of it looked like an airplane anymore. It looked like something that had survived a hurricane and a gunfight at the same time. In the cockpit, Donahue kept the trembling yoke braced with both hands. Sweat rolled down his temples. He had one engine coughing, one barely producing power, and two that were functioning only because the crew refused to acknowledge how bad they truly sounded. Beside him, Lieutenant Harris monitored the fuel gauges and the route home, tracing their position on a map fluttering in the draft. The numbers never looked friendly. Fuel was disappearing faster than their destination was approaching. Yet no one said out loud what they all feared. They might make it within sight of their home, field only to ditch short of the runway behind the cockpit bulkhead. The bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Tully, sat on the floor with his back against the blown open nose compartment. He could see daylight through holes the size of his fist. The plexiglass nose blister had shattered early in the fight, And now the slipstream roared through the compartment like a living thing. Every few minutes he ran his fingers across his face to check if the tiny cuts from flying shards were bleeding again. He didn't care. He just wanted to see the runway at Benghazi appear on the horizon. The intercom crackled, barely alive. Pilot to crew. We're going to start letting her down to 2,000 feet. Save fuel. Keep sharp eyes. If she quits on us, we'll need to set her down wherever we can. The words echoed through every compartment. There was no fear left, just acceptance and grim endurance. They had already beaten the odds by surviving the flak belt, the fighters, the fuel leak, the fire, and the endless rattling dive away from the refineries. If the old Liberator wanted to give up now, no one would blame her. But Donahue knew something the plane didn't. She wasn't allowed to die yet. Not this close. Not after what the crew had endured. As they sank lower, the coastline of North Africa came into view. A collective exhale moved through the crew. The desert looked pale and endless, stretching toward the faint glint of the Mediterranean. But the men weren't looking at the sand. They were searching for a thin strip of metal and concrete in the distance. Their home, their refuge, their proof that they had done the impossible. Pilot. This is tail. I think the stabilizer's cracking. Donahue tightened his jaw. Copy, hold on back there. Not long now. The tail gunner checked again, watching a thin-line spiderweb through the metal near the root of the stabilizer. Every vibration made it worse. He considered reporting how fast the crack was growing, and then chose not to. The pilot already had enough to carry Dot. At 15 miles out, the fuel gauges began to tremble at empty. Harris tapped the glass as if that could convince the remaining fumes to behave. Donahue eased the throttle back, giving the engines just enough breath to keep turning. The Liberator sagged again, but stayed aloft, its wings barely holding lift. Below, the desert airfield shimmered under the afternoon sun. Benghazi Tower. This is damage 6-2. Inbound with significant issues. Request emergency landing. The radio hissed, then replied with urgency. Damage 6-2, cleared for immediate approach. Winds steady from the northwest. Medical and crash crew are standing by. The crew didn't cheer. They didn't move. They stayed silent, suspended between hope and exhaustion, praying the bomber could endure the final few minutes. The runway grew larger. The flaps extended halfway before jamming. The landing gear groaned on the way down, threatening to retract again. Donahue held the yoke like he was holding the life of every man inside. The B-24 dropped below 50 feet. The engines sputtered. One quit entirely. The remaining 3 backfired like angry cannons. The bomber touched down hard, metal shrieking, the left gear nearly collapsing. The plane lurched, bounced once, and then slammed down again. Donahue held it straight, fighting the pull of the shredded wing as the ground rushed beneath them. Dust exploded behind the wheels. The aircraft rolled, slowing, until finally, impossibly, it came to a shaking stop, silence. Then the men exhaled as one, shoulders collapsing, hands trembling. They had made it. The bomber, torn open by more than 800 bullet holes, still lived. The crew, soaked in sweat and smoke, still breathed. And as the ground crew sprinted toward the wounded aircraft, one mechanic stared in disbelief at the Swiss cheese fuselage and whispered the same words spoken across airfields on that long, brutal day. How in God's name did this thing make it home? The ground crew reached the B-24 at a run, slowing only when they realized they could not touch the aircraft without gloves. The skin of the bomber was still hot from the hours of burning fuel and relentless engine strain. Smoke curled out of vents, seams, and open gun ports like the breath of a wounded animal. Crew Chief Master Sergeant Daniel Pike froze mid-step when he first laid eyes on the fuselage. There were holes everywhere, from the size of rifle rounds to the size of dinner plates. Entire ribs of the wing structure were exposed. A 6-foot gash ran across the belly where flak had torn through and barely missed the fuel tanks. The tail section sagged as if it had been held together by hope alone. Pike placed both palms on the battered skin and whispered, "Boys, no one is ever going to believe this." Inside, the crew began to climb out. Donahue emerged from the cockpit first, his flight suit stained black from smoke and hydraulic fluid. He slid down the side of the fuselage, landing with weak legs. A medic caught him by the arm. "You hurt." "Not as much as the plane is," Donahue replied, looking back at the Liberator with something like affection and disbelief. Lieutenant Harris climbed out next, clutching his map case like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Waist Gunner Keller had to be helped out of the side hatch. His leg was stiff from shrapnel cuts he had barely noticed during the mission. The tail gunner came last, limping as he held one arm against his chest. The medics guided him to a stretcher, but he waved them off. "It can wait." "Check the others first," he insisted, even though blood had soaked through the sleeve of his flight jacket, as the men sat in the shade of a maintenance truck, sipping water and letting the medics assess their wounds. The officers and mechanics walked slow circles around the bomber. They pointed at damage, shook their heads, and muttered technical terms that no longer meant anything. The scale of destruction defied standard procedure. Every section of the aircraft had been hit. There were holes clean through the bomb bay doors. The tail turret had lost half its armor. One propeller blade had been bent backward by a flak burst. The right wing's fuel line had been repaired mid-flight with chewing gum and a prayer. Pike crouched under the wing and spotted the crack the tail gunner had mentioned. It ran almost the entire length of the stabilizer route, jagged and widening toward the rear. Any further flexing and the entire tail might have torn free. The fact that it had stayed intact during the landing felt like a miracle delivered at the exact second it was needed. General Caldwell arrived minutes later, stepping out of a jeep with urgency. He had been briefed that one of the returning Liberators was in critical shape, but he had not expected this. As he approached the plane, he slowed, taking in the sight of the shredded fuselage. "Is this the one?" he asked. Pike nodded. "Yes, sir. This is damage 6-2. The general rested his hands on his hips. "It looks like it fought the entire Luftwaffe by itself." "Sir," Pike said quietly, "I think it just about did." Caldwell walked to the nose and peered through the shattered plexiglass. Then he examined the midsection, the wings, the tail, noting every torn panel and burnt patch of metal. When he finally turned to Donahue and his crew, he simply asked, "How did you keep her flying?" Donahue looked down at his hands, still shaking, then at the bomber that had carried them home. "We didn't. She kept us flying." Word spread quickly across the base. Pilots and air crews from every squadron wandered toward the runway, drawn by the rumors. They stopped in their tracks when they saw the airplane. Some let out low whistles. Others muttered curses in disbelief. A few walked right up to the fuselage and slipped their fingers into the holes punched clean through the metal. They counted hundreds of them before giving up. A young pilot shook his head in awe. "You sure this isn't 2 or 3 planes stacked together?" Keller grinned weakly. "Feels like we went through 2 or 3 missions at once." One mechanic crawled inside the bomb bay and immediately backed out again, eyes wide. "There's flak wedged between the fuel cells. Live pieces. If this thing had taken one more spark, it would have lit up like the 4th of July. Donahue exhaled hard. He hadn't known that part. He didn't want to. Caldwell stepped back to address the small crowd. "Get every photographer you can find. This aircraft needs to be documented. History won't understand it unless we prove it happened." As cameras clicked, capturing the scars, the shattered panels, the twisted metal, Donahue looked at his crew. For the first time since sunrise, the tension began to release from their shoulders. They had flown into hell and brought their bomber back out again. But none of them knew that the real impact of their story was only beginning. The photographs taken that afternoon would circulate across bases, briefing rooms, and eventually newspapers. They would inspire recruits, shake doubters, and remind commanders that the spirit of a crew could push a machine far beyond what engineers believed possible. The B-24 had proved something that day. Not that it was invincible, not that it was stronger than steel, but that courage, teamwork, and a refusal to surrender could keep even the most broken machine alive, long enough to bring its men home by sunset. The photographs had finished developing in the tiny dark room near the operations hut. The technicians laid each printout on the long wooden table, lining them up in rows. Officers filed in, staring down at the images with disbelief that grew with every angle and every frame. One photo showed the right wing from above, the metal skin peeled back like the lid of a tin ration can. Another revealed the tail section, its internal framing exposed through a ragged hole the size of a man's torso. There were shots of the bomb bay doors buckled inward, shots of the cockpit glass fractured into a spiderweb of cracks, and shots of the engines blackened by flames that had somehow never reached the fuel tanks. When the general returned to the operations hut, he examined the prints in silence. At last he sighed, pulled out a marker, and wrote in bold letters on the edge of one photo, "The plane that should not have flown." But did. The phrase stuck. Within hours, men across the base began calling the aircraft by a new name, the 800-hole wonder. Meanwhile, Damage 6-2 sat on the far end of the field under floodlights, surrounded by ropes and warning signs. Mechanics worked around it like surgeons, removing fragments of flak, tracing every damaged hydraulic line, and assessing each torn panel. What they found only deepened the mystery of how it had stayed airborne. They counted ruptured control cables, splintered spars, and ailerons that barely responded to manual movement. They discovered that the fuel mixture had been so unstable that a single spark in the engine nacelle would have ended the mission instantly. The makeshift repairs the crew had performed in the sky were borderline impossible. Everything they had done should have failed. And yet, it hadn't. Donahue visited the plane again after dusk, when most of the crews had gone to the mess hall. He stood quietly beneath the wing, listening to the distant hum of generators and the chirp of insects beyond the perimeter fence. Without the chaos and adrenaline, the bomber looked even more wounded. Every hole, every rip, every scorch mark caught the light in a way that made it seem alive. Like a veteran covered in battle scars earned in trenches no one else had seen. Harris joined him a minute later. His uniform was clean now, his injuries bandaged, but his eyes still carried the fatigue of the mission. "Thought you'd be asleep by now," Harris said. Can't sleep, Donahue replied. Not after today. He looked up at the patched wing. She didn't quit on us. Not once. No, Harris agreed. And we didn't quit on her. They stood there in silence until a jeep rolled up beside them. Sergeant Pike climbed out and approached with a clipboard under his arm. Lieutenant, Pike said, Command wants to know if you're naming her officially. Is that necessary? Donahue asked, after what she survived today. They want something to put on the report. Harris smirked. Something besides impossible. Donahue looked back at the fuselage, at the hundreds of holes that marked every second of the battle. He thought about the storm of flak, the fighters, the fire inside the engines, and the way the aircraft had shuddered but never surrendered. Call her. He paused, considering. Call her Iron Courage. Pike wrote the name down carefully, nodding with approval. Fitting, maybe, Donahue said. But she wasn't iron. She was hanging on by threads. Harris smiled. Sometimes that's all courage is. Over the next week, the story of Iron Courage traveled far beyond the base. Couriers carried the photographs to headquarters. Pilots coming through on rotation brought tales of the bomber back to England and North Africa. Newspapers caught wind of an American plane, returning from a deadly mission with 800 holes, and published dramatized sketches of the event. Even the engineers who designed the B-24 were stunned. They requested the photos for study, trying to understand how the airframe had avoided catastrophic failure. Some suggested the crew had performed one of the greatest displays of airmanship of the war. Others believed the bomber had simply refused to die. But for Donahue and his men, what mattered most was quieter, simpler. They had walked through the fire, faced the full force of the enemy's guns, and come home together. They knew how close they had come to disappearing without a trace. They knew that a different gust of wind, a single failed patch, or one more spark could have changed everything. And they knew the aircraft had endured it all alongside them. On the morning, when engineers finally began the full reconstruction, Donahue placed his hand on the battered fuselage one last time. Thank you, he whispered, for getting us home. Iron Courage would not fly again. The damage was too severe, the repairs too costly, and the scars too deep. But her pieces would be studied, her photos archived, and her legacy etched into the memory of every man who had ever climbed into a bomber and wondered whether he would live to see another sunrise. Some aircraft became aces. Some became symbols. Iron Courage became something rarer. She became proof that even in the sky filled with fire and steel, survival was possible when courage held steady and every man on board refused to yield.